No one would ever want to find themselves on the wrong side of the criminal justice system, or better yet, not even on the right side of it. As defined by Google, the criminal justice system is the system or process in the community by which crimes are investigated, and the persons suspected thereof are taken into custody, prosecuted in court, and punished if found guilty, provisions being made for their correction and rehabilitation. But what if the justice system itself became injustice? What if proving your innocence became futile? What if death is the end of your story? All these because you were at the wrong place, walked home at the wrong time, or just simply on the bad side of the wrong police officer. More than 2,500 people in the United States alone have found themselves on death row since 1973, many of whom have been sentenced to death, even though they were and still are innocent. Here are the top 8 innocent people who were sent to death row for being on the wrong side. Number 8. George Kelly. George Kelly's story takes place back in 1949, where a break-in changed his life forever. Not just that, he was not even there. One day, a masked man broke into the office of the cinema manager at the Cameo Theatre in Liverpool, England. This happened when they were counting the day's earnings. The suspect shot 2 men on the spot before proceeding through the window to escape. An intense manhunt that ended with the arrest of 2 men is understandable after such a gruesome murder. This case, however, involved Charles Connolly and George Kelly being arrested and facing serious criminal charges and potential execution, regardless of their alibis. Unfortunately for George Kelly, the court case did not exactly swing in his favour. The witnesses brought to testify against Kelly were those people who would want him thrown under the bus, even with zero physical evidence linking him to the scene of the crime. And the most insane of all was that Donald Johnson, the first-hand witness who was actually there at the scene, was never presented in court, and his importance in the shooting case was easily dusted off. Moreover, the presiding judge, who was obviously biased towards their side, led some people to believe that Kelly had just been set up in an elaborate scheme. 53 years later, in 2003, George Kelly was exonerated and given a proper burial. Number 7. Mahmoud Matan. The case of Mahmoud Matan was drenched in racism and racial profiling, just like many cases of wrongful execution. Mahmoud Matan was born in British Somalia in 1923. In hindsight, his decision to move to Wales was probably a terrible one after working at sea for quite some time. Back then, being a black man married to a Welsh woman did not exactly win him too many favours. He was among a community of racists and bullies, which proved that he was on the wrong side when a local business owner was robbed and killed in 1962. The manhunt, which seemed such a tough ask for the police, just picked Mahmoud Matan as the culprit. He was convicted by an all-white jury based on contradicting testimonies and eyewitness reports from a 12-year-old child. It was also unfortunate that Matan had difficulty speaking their language. He was given a defense lawyer who referred to him as a semi-civilized savage. All this tragically ended up with his execution just 2 months after his conviction in 1998. A further investigation revealed that he was innocent. His family was given a cash settlement for his wrongful death, but would Matan be happy with it? Number 6. Ellis Wayne. In 1981, Ellis Wayne was accused and charged for the disappearance of the college student named Evelyn Joy. She was eventually found in a creek, raped and stabbed to death. If you think that an autopsy report would save poor Ellis, you'd be wrong. The examiner did not bring Ellis's innocence to light, instead changing the facts with a clear intent to set Ellis up. His attorneys managed to find some evidence that should have cleared his name, but the court decided for convoluted legal reasons that despite the evidence presented, his appeal would not be entertained. He was executed in November 1996. Number 5. Reuben Cantu. Justice is sometimes more interested in prosecuting some random person for a crime and sentencing them to death than prosecuting actual criminals, willingly throwing an innocent civilian into the electric chair. Reuben Cantu was a young man from Texas back in 1966. He was charged for shooting a man in San Antonio when he was 17. Juan Marino, who was also injured in the incident, had testified against Cantu, identifying him as the killer. but since Reuben Cantu was not what he claimed, it seemed quite obvious that he was just trying to put Cantu into a bad position. However, Reuben Cantu was involved in another incident, this time relating to the injury of a plainclothes policeman in a bar, which put Cantu at the wrong side of the police. Again, Juan Marino eventually identified Reuben Cantu as the shooter, but later renounced his statement a decade after Reuben's execution. He said that the police pressured him into identifying Cantu because Cantu had hurt another police officer. Texas executed Reuben Cantu by lethal injection, making him the 5th juvenile offender executed by the state. His final request was a piece of bubblegum, which was denied. So heartbreaking. He was asked if he had a last statement. He simply said, "No, sir." Number 4. Nathaniel Woods. It was shown on the news as Alabama was about to execute 44-year-old Nathaniel Woods for the murder of 3 police officers he did not kill. We have another story which happened just recently about an innocent person wrongly accused and put to death. Unlike the people we had talked about, Nathaniel Woods was no doubt a criminal during an incident in a crack house. Woods had surrendered to 3 police officers during the raid, after which Kerry Spencer burst into the room and shot the 3 police officers. However, it was Nathaniel who was offered a plea deal of 20 to 25 years for being an accomplice, despite the fact that the only thing he was guilty of was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Woods turned down the plea, and so the police went ahead to the next level of wickedness and charged him with capital murder. To add insult to the injury, Nathaniel's girlfriend was forced to testify against him, else she would be charged with parole violation. Woods' lawyers were not allowed to present proof of police harassment and misconduct. He was then found guilty of the murder of 3 police officers and was executed in 2020. Number 3. Dominique Ray. Dominique Ray's case was nationalised because of how crazy it literally was. After being charged with the rape and murder of Tiffany Harville, he was executed based on the testimony of a mental patient. And as usual, the police seemed tired of looking for the culprit and so just decided on whom they would pick. This time, they used Marcus Alden, a man who suffers from schizophrenia and auditory hallucinations, to get to their business. Alden first confessed that he was the culprit and then changed his mind and decided that Ray did it instead. No physical evidence needed. What even is due process anyway? In February 1998, Ray's defense sought to have Alden checked by a neuropsychologist, but was objected to by the prosecutor, who claimed that Alden had no mental impairment and there was no question about his mental ability. What do you think of this prosecutor? Must have been a very bloodthirsty one. Dominique Ray was eventually sentenced to death in September 1999. 2 years before his execution, documented evidence of Alden's mental situation and the prosecutor's knowledge at the time of the trial was brought to light. In an attempt to get a fresh trial, Ray argued that vital evidence had been deliberately suppressed, but the Alabama State Attorney's Office hadn't killed anyone in a while, so they successfully petitioned the state court before him. He was executed in February of 2019 after both his claim of due process and prosecutorial misconduct were dismissed by the court. Number 2. Joe Aridi. This was the second most tragic case on the list. Joe Aridi, a man born in 1915 who had a developmental disorder, leaving him with a mental IQ of 46, similar to a 6-year-old, and serious mental difficulties regardless of his physical age. In the city of Pueblo, a 15-year-old girl named Dorothy Drain was raped and murdered in her home on August 15, 1936. Her little sister was also injured. Frank Aguilar, a former employee of Dorothy's father, was caught and identified as the killer, having all evidence point to him, and was executed for his crimes. So what does this have to do with Joe Aridi? Well, due to a series of unfortunate incidents, Aridi had found himself in police custody in Cheyenne City after escaping a mental institute. Since the local sheriff was eager to get a piece of such a high-profile murder-rape case, he took Aridi and forced him to confess. It was not very hard to get from a man with a mental age of 6 to admit to being cohorts with Frank Aguilar on January 6, 1939. He was completely unaware of his impending death. He had his last meal of ice cream and was subsequently executed in the gas chamber. In 2011, he was pardoned and his name was cleared. Number 1. George Stinney. The case that sits at the top of this terrible pile is none other than the case of 14-year-old George Stinney, who was charged with the killing of 2 girls and dumping their bodies back in the year of 1944. For you to get a clearer perspective, Stinney was a 90-pound, 5'2" teenager, and there was no evidence of him even being anywhere near the scene of the crime. So how could he possibly have been charged with such a serious capital offence? Well, as you might have noticed, the police did it specifically. George's family was then threatened to leave the city or they would be lynched. It took only 10 minutes and 12 all-white jurors to decide that little George Stinney was to be executed. In prison, George asked his cellmate why these people wanted to kill him, though he had not done anything wrong. Such a pitiful moment that was. The next day, he was marched to an electric chair designed for adults. The Bible he was holding was used to prop him up on his seat, and his life ended. Later in December 2014, 70 years after his execution, Judge Carmen Mullen ruled that he had not received a fair trial, hadn't been effectively defended, and his Sixth Amendment right had been violated. She also found that the execution of a 14-year-old juvenile completely violated the Constitution's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. How I wish there were more judges like Judge Carmen Mullen. Maybe then, the execution of innocent people wouldn't really happen. What do you think of our video today? Let us know your thoughts.